Guys, Deejus here, and this is part 2 of the Choosing a CO series. Now we'll be covering Tier 3. Now Tier 3 is my favorite tier because I think it's the most balanced, there's great CO selections, it's really hard to go wrong. It's not dominated by a few COs like in Tier 4 where Jake and Ada run the show. And every CO basically specializes in something. So as before, we'll be grouping Tier 3 according to standard play, but we'll be covering both standard and fog gameplay and tactics.
Tier 3, where we see the likes of Andy, Drake, Kindle, Lash, and Rachel.
So let's start off with Andy. Now, Andy is typically my default choice for Tier 3, although he's not quite as strong a default as Jake was for Tier 4. Andy is incredibly flexible and he'll perform decently on pretty much all maps. He's not always the strongest, but he's very rarely the weakest selection. So now, Andy doesn't have a day-to-day power, but he changes how both players play the game. Basically, as an Andy player, you want to withdraw your weakened units and hide them for later when you use your superpower, which makes them basically come back to life. Whereas if you're facing Andy, you want to make sure, absolutely sure, you finish off his weakened units, which can be a bit more difficult in Fog where they can easily hide. Andy also particularly loves stronger units like medium tanks, neo-tanks, fighters, etc. that often survive attacks and are difficult to kill. He also counters Rachel in this tier, especially in Fog. We'll go into more detail on that later. Also, what I like about him is there's flexibility with his superpower. Sometimes you can choose it halfway through your turn after you damage some of your units and then heal them up later, or you can pop it at the beginning of the turn to get that nice extra firepower boost and movement boost. Regarding maps, I'd say Andy is stronger on medium and large maps, where they typically have more units and more bases. He prefers maps with less comm towers, as it'll make sure it's easier to survive 2-hit KOs by tanks from opposing player. He's typically weaker on smaller maps where day-to-day powers such as Kindles and Lashes are a lot more noticeable, and the fact that he doesn't have one stands out. He's pretty equally good in both Fog and standard play, maybe slightly better in Fog due to the nature that he can hide some of his weakened units easier in forests. So next up we have Kindle, and if I'm being honest, Kindle is one of my least favorite COs to go up against, not just in Tier 3 but overall. She has one of the strongest day-to-day powers in Tier 3 alongside Lash. A 40% bonus on cities, which is insane. Basically her specialty is forcing opponents' units off of cities and excelling in the early capture game. She excels in the early game using these tactics, but she struggles as the game goes on as the power of her CO power diminishes. So you need to be aggressive with her, you're basically on a timer. This can make her a bit more difficult to use for newer players. Similar to Andy, Kindle kind of changes how the game is played. You need to be especially careful how you play around cities in your game. I'll show you a quick example right here. So let's assume Kindle is yellow and black is Andy. Andy's position looks pretty impenetrable right now. If you attack one of his tanks with your medium tank, or attack with one of your tanks, you're going to get hit back pretty hard with his medium tank and other tanks. However, using Kindle, we can annihilate his army. First, we pop Kindle's CO power, doing 3 damage to all of Andy's units on bases, and lowering his tank to 7 HP. Next, we take out his top infantry, allowing us to attack his tank from multiple angles. Now we attack the base tank with one of our full HP tanks and follow it up with another attack by our weakened tank, which eliminates it. Now we bring in the big guns. Kindle's medium tank one-shots Andy's medium tank from the city, completely changing the calculus of the game, and likely leading to the resignation of black. Regarding maps, Kindle loves aggressive maps. Maps where there are a lot of contested properties and a lot of fighting near properties, where she can really abuse her day-to-day power of 40% attack bonus on cities. She likes to secure an early income advantage so the game doesn't go on too long, where her CO power diminishes. She's slightly better in Fog, as it's hard to notice her tactics where she can really abuse her CO power and prepare for it effectively. Next up is Drake, one of my favorite Tier 3 COs. He's more of a stally CO in Tier 3 and doesn't really mind unit buildup, which can lead to a powerful superpower. So if you're basically tied in income and there's no fighting going on, he doesn't mind at all, he can just sit back and chill. This is essentially the opposite of Kindle, who really needs to go for the throat early on in the game to secure an advantage. Drake doesn't mind just sitting back and relaxing. The decrease in his air unit's firepower is noticeable, but it's not as huge a deal as some make it out to be. I typically still make battlecopters in Fog because the opponent isn't really expecting it, and even though they're weaker, once you add on a comm tower, it's not too much of a big deal. I typically don't really go with copters in standard though, because they're expected and they just aren't that great. Another thing to keep in mind when using Drake in Fog is that when you use your superpower, you will lose vision. So make sure that you plan your attack in advance, and that the loss of vision doesn't hinder your attack. Regarding maps, typically bigger is better for Drake, as he prefers to have more units on the map, so his superpower is even more effective. He also prefers safer maps where there's less contested properties, and he can sit back and let the enemy come to him. Next up we got Lash, and she's got one of the best day-to-day powers in this tier alongside Kindle. Essentially all her land units get a 10% firepower bonus at least, depending on the terrain. So she loves maps where there's heavy terrain, tons of forest, especially forest near cities, which can help her secure 2-hit KOs on city dwellers. She prefers smaller maps, where her day-to-day power shines even more, and preferably shorter games as well. Generally, Lash is a land specialist. She prefers maps where there's less usage of air units like battlecopters because they don't get any of her terrain bonuses. She also prefers standard play over fog, because in fog it's a little harder to utilize forest squares, because oftentimes the enemy units might be hiding in the forest, which makes it more difficult for her to use it more effectively. Last and well, least in my opinion, yeah, I'm a Rachel hater, we have Rachel, the small map specialist. Similar to Andy, she lacks a really good day-to-day power and almost exclusively relies on her superpower. The thing about Rachel's superpower is it's easily mitigated, especially in fog, and Andy kind of serves as a hard counter against her. I'll show you how you can abuse this power in a fog game. So let's pretend that Rachel's black on this map. If she used her superpower right now, it would do a lot of damage and decimate my center. The thing about her superpower is it has 3 missiles. One targets the most infantry, one targets the most numerical damage, and one damages the most funds worth of damage. So we're able to mitigate this and draw 2 missiles away if you make an infantry ball. This works because one of the missiles is drawn to the most infantry units, and the other missile is drawn to the most units total. So if you have most of your units bunched up in an infantry ball, 2 of them will strike there, and only a 3rd missile will do 3 damage to a small area of valuable units, as so. Another thing you want to do is draw the missiles towards units that are in the back, that aren't in a fight right now, so Rachel can't pick off those weakened units. So if by putting them towards this medium tank and copter, it has minimal effect. And if I was Andy, basically next turn I would completely heal of my units. That's why Andy is such a hard counter to Rachel. As a Rachel user, you typically want to use your Super C power when they least expect it, because if they do expect it, they'll be able to mitigate the damage significantly, as I just shown. Another thing I've seen is in fog matches, sometimes people use Rachel's normal power, which is equivalent to a luck increase, because the super power isn't that great. That concludes the overview of the Tier 3 COs. I hope you learned something. I hope this will be very beneficial for you in the global leagues. As always, feel free to leave some feedback, etc. in the comment section. Have a good one.